saw my son standing at the arrivals gate with 2 duffel bags at his feet and my granddaughter asleep against his shoulder. He didn't see me at first. He was staring at the floor the way people do when they're trying to hold themselves together in public. I had driven 40 minutes to get to that airport. I hadn't asked why. When your child calls you at 11 at night and his voice sounds like something inside him has cracked, you don't ask questions. You grab your keys. Mom. That was all he said when he looked up and saw me. I know, I said. Give her to me. I took my granddaughter Eleanor from his arms. She was 3 years old and still in her pajamas, the pink ones with the little rabbits on the feet. She stirred for just a moment, pressed her face into my neck, and went back to sleep. I held her tight and looked at my son over the top of her head. Get the bags, I said. We'll talk in the car. His name is Daniel. He is 34 years old and he worked for 11 years building something he believed in, a logistics and supply company that his mother-in-law, Patricia Holt, had handed him when he married her daughter, Vanessa. Patricia had told him it was a gift, a fresh start, a sign that he was welcomed into the family. I never trusted Patricia Holt, not from the first Sunday dinner when she smiled at me across the table and said, "We're so glad Daniel found someone to keep him grounded." She said it sweetly. She said it like a compliment. But I had been around long enough to recognize a woman who was already measuring you for a box she intended to put you in. I kept my opinion to myself. Daniel loved Vanessa. Vanessa was warm and funny, and she made my son laugh in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy. I decided Patricia was not my business. That was my first mistake. Daniel didn't speak much on the drive home. He sat in the passenger seat with his hands on his knees and stared out the window at the highway lights. Eleanor was buckled in the back seat in the travel car seat I had kept in my trunk since she was born, something my son used to tease me about. "Mom, you don't need to carry that everywhere." I had never explained why I kept it there. Some instincts don't require explanation. She told me the company was never mine, Daniel finally said, somewhere around exit 47. I kept my eyes on the road. Tell me everything. The story came out slowly, the way bad news always does, in pieces, with long pauses between them. Vanessa had been pulling away for nearly 2 years. Daniel had seen it, but told himself it was stress, that it was the new responsibilities of having Eleanor, that marriages went through seasons, and this was just a cold one. He kept working. He kept providing. He reorganized the company, expanded 2 new distribution routes, brought the annual revenue up by 31%. He thought if he built something solid enough, it would hold them together. What he didn't know was that Patricia had been meeting with lawyers for 8 months. The company, Holt Meridian Logistics, had been transferred into Daniel's name when he and Vanessa married, or so Daniel believed. What he had signed on that day, amid the champagne and congratulations, was not a transfer of ownership. It was a management agreement, a detailed, binding management agreement that gave Daniel full operational control but retained Patricia as the silent majority shareholder. A clause buried on page 11 stated that the agreement could be terminated at any time with 60 days written notice if the Holt family determined the management relationship was no longer aligned with company values. Daniel had never read page 11. The lawyer at the table that day was Patricia's lawyer. 6 weeks ago, a letter arrived at the office. Daniel opened it thinking it was a vendor renewal. It was 60 days written notice of management termination, signed by Patricia Holt and countersigned by Vanessa. That same evening, Vanessa sat him down and told him the marriage was over. Eleanor had been asleep in the next room. They'd been living in a house on the Holt family property, a beautiful craftsman-style home that Patricia had built for them as a wedding gift. The deed, Daniel now understood, was in Patricia's name. He had never thought to ask. Why would he? It was a gift. They were family. After the termination letter, Patricia had given them 30 days to vacate. Vanessa stayed. Daniel packed what he could carry, and he took his daughter to the only place he knew was truly his. He came to me. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine. I sat for a moment in the dark with my hands resting on the steering wheel. 63 years old. I had built and sold 2 businesses in my life. The first was a regional property management company I started at 31 with $11,000 and a secondhand copier. The second was a commercial real estate consultancy I grew for 18 years before selling it the spring I turned 58. I was not a wealthy woman in the way that people on television are wealthy, but I understood contracts. I understood the difference between what someone tells you and what the paper actually says. I had learned that difference the hard way 30 years ago from a business partner who smiled at me the way Patricia Holt smiled and used the same warm voice and had also buried something important on page 11. I looked at my son in the passenger seat. "Did you keep copies of everything?" I asked. "Every document, every email, every contract?" He looked surprised by the question. Yes, I have everything. I've been running that company for 11 years, Mom. I have records going back to the first week." "Good," I said. "Go put Eleanor to bed in the guest room, then come back downstairs. We have work to do. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters." I was not angry that night. People expect a mother in that situation to be furious, to want to call Patricia and scream, to make threats, to cry at the kitchen table. I felt none of that. What I felt was something much quieter and much more purposeful. I felt the particular clarity that comes when a situation finally makes sense, when all the small wrong things you had noticed over the years, the too sweet smiles, the offhand comments, the gentle maneuvering, snap into a pattern you can finally name. Patricia had spent 11 years building a trap. She had been patient and careful, and she had used love as the architecture. She gave Daniel a company and called it a gift. She gave them a house and called it family. She gave him 11 years of labor and called it opportunity. And then, when it suited her, she called her lawyer. I had spent 63 years learning that the most dangerous agreements are the ones dressed up as kindness. I poured 2 cups of coffee and I spread Daniel's documents across my kitchen table. He had everything. Every quarterly filing, every vendor contract, every board minute, every email chain, 11 years of meticulous records, because my son, whatever else might be said, was always thorough. I had taught him that. Document everything. Trust people and document everything. We worked until 3 in the morning. By the time we finished, I had identified 4 things. The first, Patricia's management agreement had a flaw she likely didn't know about or assumed Daniel would never find. The agreement required annual written reaffirmation signed by both parties to remain in force. For the first 3 years, those reaffirmations had been signed. But in year 4, the reaffirmation was never executed. Patricia's legal team had apparently forgotten or assumed Daniel would never check. Under the terms of the agreement itself, the management structure had technically lapsed. What remained was a legal gray area that a skilled attorney could argue either way, but it was a crack. Cracks matter. The second, over the previous 2 years, Patricia had authorized a series of strategic consulting fees paid to a company called Holbrook Advisory Group. The payments totaled over $400,000. Holbrook Advisory Group was a single-member LLC registered in Delaware. The registered agent's address traced to a law firm that also represented Vanessa personally in other matters. This was not on its face illegal, but it was the kind of thing that makes forensic accountants sit up straight. The third, Daniel had, without realizing its significance, documented a conversation in an email chain where Patricia explicitly referred to the company as Daniel's company while negotiating a supplier contract on his behalf. There were 6 similar instances across the 11-year record. Emails in which Patricia, in the course of ordinary business, had treated him as owner. Statements that directly contradicted the position she was now taking. The fourth, the house on the Holt property. Daniel had, over 11 years, funded nearly $200,000 in improvements to that property. A new roof, a kitchen renovation, a detached garage, landscaping. None of it was reimbursable under the original agreement. But under a legal doctrine called unjust enrichment, a court might very well disagree. I refilled my coffee and looked at my son across the table. "You're not walking away with nothing," I said. He looked exhausted and hollowed out, and something behind his eyes was still trying to believe me. "Mom, they have lawyers. Patricia has had lawyers on this for months. I don't even know where to start." "I do," I said. "Her name is Margaret O.C. She had been my attorney for 19 years, since I hired her when she was a junior associate at $42 an hour, and she had quietly and thoroughly dismantled a fraudulent partnership agreement that would have cost me my first business. She was now a named partner, and her hourly rate reflected it, and I had never once begrudged her a dollar of it. I texted her at 3:17 in the morning. I apologized for the hour and said I needed her first available appointment. She texted back at 3:22. She had been up with a case brief anyway. She said 7:30 a.m. I have good people in my life. I have spent 63 years collecting them carefully. Margaret reviewed everything over the following 10 days. She brought in a forensic accountant named Carl, who had the mild manner of a librarian and the instincts of someone who had spent 30 years finding what people hid in numbers. Carl found the Holbrook advisory payments within the first hour. By day 3, he had established that Patricia had been extracting consulting fees from the company, her own family's company, the one she had given Daniel to run, at a rate that had materially impacted the company's profit margins for 2 consecutive fiscal years. He also found that the payments had continued after the management termination notice was sent, during the 60-day period in which Daniel was still legally the operating manager. That last part was important. It meant the payments had been authorized by Patricia during a period when she was legally required to defer to Daniel's operational authority. Margaret called it a significant exposure. Carl called it textbook. I called Patricia Holt on a Tuesday morning, 12 days after I had picked up my son at the airport. I called her from my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the sun coming through the window, and Eleanor sitting on the living room rug behind me, playing with the set of wooden blocks she had decided were her favorite things in the world. Patricia answered on the second ring. Her voice was the same as always, warm, smooth, the voice of a woman who had always known exactly how rooms worked and how to arrange herself within them. "Frances," she said. "That was my name, Frances. What a surprise. How are you?" "I'm well, Patricia," I said. "I'm calling because I think it would be in everyone's interest to have a conversation before things become more complicated than they need to be." A brief pause. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you do," I said. "My attorney has been reviewing Daniel's records from the past 11 years. Carl Whitmore has been reviewing the company's financials. We found some things that concern us. I think you'd prefer to resolve this quietly, and I think we probably can, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to sit down before anything else happens." The warmth in her voice cooled by several degrees. "I'll have my attorney call yours." "That would be fine," I said. "Have a good morning, Patricia." I hung up and looked out the window at the backyard, where the oak tree my late husband planted the year Daniel was born was just beginning to show its spring leaves. Eleanor toddled over and pressed one of her wooden blocks into my hand. "For you, Grandma," she said. I closed my hand around it. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said. "Thank you very much." The negotiation took 11 weeks. Patricia's attorneys were good. They were expensive and experienced, and they pushed back on every point with the disciplined patience of people who had done this many times before. The management agreement lapse was contested vigorously. They argued that conduct had effectively ratified the agreement regardless of the missing signatures, and they were not entirely wrong. That argument could have gone either way in front of a judge. But the Holbrook payments were another matter. Carl's report was 62 pages. It documented not just the $400,000 in consulting fees, but an additional pattern of expense reclassifications that had reduced the company's taxable income over a 3-year period in ways that were, Margaret told me carefully, very difficult to characterize as anything other than intentional. The company's outside auditor, it emerged, had flagged 2 of these reclassifications in internal memos. Those memos had not been shared with Daniel, despite his role as operating manager. When Margaret presented the report in a settlement conference in week 7, Patricia's lead attorney asked for a recess that lasted 45 minutes. When they came back, the tone of the negotiation had changed. I am not going to describe everything that was settled because some of it is confidential and I gave my word. What I will say is this. Daniel walked out of that process with a formal ownership stake in Holt Meridian Logistics that was documented correctly this time, reviewed by 2 independent attorneys, with no clauses buried on any page. He also walked out with the reimbursement for the property improvements on the house and an agreement that Eleanor would have a stable and fully funded educational trust in her name, administered independently. Vanessa and Daniel's divorce proceeded separately, and I stayed out of it. That was between them. My concern was my son and my granddaughter, and making sure that when it was over, they were standing on ground that belonged to them. Patricia and I have not spoken since that Tuesday morning phone call. I don't carry anger about that. I spent a season of my life carrying anger about a betrayal, and I know exactly what it costs and what it fails to return. I set it down a long time ago, and I don't intend to pick it up again. What I do carry is something different. It's the image of my son at that arrival's gate, staring at the floor, holding his sleeping daughter and 2 duffel bags, trying to keep himself together in public. I carry that because I think it's important to remember the exact weight of what people who love us are sometimes asked to carry alone before they finally call. He called me. That's what I want him to remember. Not the documents, not the settlement conference, not Carl's 62 pages. I want him to remember that he called and I drove 40 minutes without asking questions, and when I got there, I took Eleanor from his arms and I told him to get the bags. That's what you do. Eleanor has been with me for 4 months now, most days, while Daniel works and rebuilds. She has a drawer in the kitchen where she keeps her crayons. She has a preferred spot on the couch. She knows where I keep the good crackers, and she knows that if she asks me nicely, I will usually say yes. She is 3 years old and she is already very good at asking nicely. Last week, she brought me one of her drawings. Blue scribbles and a yellow circle and 2 tall figures standing next to something that might have been a tree or might have been a very enthusiastic bush. "That's you," she said, pointing to the taller of the 2 figures. "It looks just like me," I said. "You're very big," she said with great seriousness. I looked at her for a moment. This small person in the rabbit pajamas, carrying her wooden blocks and her crayons, and the particular resilience that children carry before the world has had time to teach them to doubt it. "So will you be," I told her. "So will you be. I am 63 years old. I have made mistakes in my life, real ones, the kind that cost you. I have trusted the wrong signatures and the wrong smiles, and I have sat at tables where the terms were not what I thought they were. I paid for every one of those lessons. But I also know this. There is a version of wisdom that only comes from having survived something, from having read the document too late and decided that next time you would read it first, from having stood in rooms where people underestimated you and filed that information away very quietly, very carefully, for when it mattered. Patricia Holt built a trap over 11 years. She was patient and she was thorough, and she used love as the architecture, because she understood that love makes people stop reading on page 10. She forgot one thing. She forgot about me. And when my son called me from that airport, I had 63 years of lessons in my hands, and I knew exactly what to do with them.